Why? Good evening, Judy. Good evening, Cindy. Good evening, John. Good evening, Mike. Good evening, Kim. Let me know. On my end, it says that we have sound now. Let me know if we do. Y'all there? Yes. Okay. Fantastic. All right. So, I think when I don't. No, it shouldn't be related to when the light blipped. I had a blip on my USB hub, my very fancy, very expensive USB hub 10.4 is getting jinky, and I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't call it expensive. I thought it was expensive. It wasn't. It was almost $100. Maybe that's not these days. So when all else fails, you unplug it and you plug it back in and you see what happens. And that's what worked. Okay, so as I was saying when you couldn't hear me, welcome to Bible Basics with Pastor Steve. And tonight we're going to be talking about David on the run from King Saul and the adventures that he had during, we're getting started on the adventures he had while he was on the run from King Saul. And originally, I wasn't going to cover this period at all. Back when I first started this, back during the pandemic. Good evening, Stella. Good evening, Charles. I was thinking I can pick the 30 to 40 most important Bible stories, most important stories in the Bible, kind of like the Lifeway curriculum, the story. And we'll get through that in less than a year. And then maybe when I'm done, I'll compile everything together. Then I decided, no, I want to cover a few more stories than that. And then I decided, no, I'm not on any time schedule, so I'm not going to worry about compiling this. And the next thing you know, I'll probably be doing this until I retire, because apparently I think all of the Bible stories are critical, important, need to know Bible stories, and hopefully you think they're important too. So at any rate, let's go ahead and have a word of prayer, shall we? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight, for you alone are my rock and my redeemer. Amen. I changed the settings on the streaming tonight. Hopefully the visual quality will be a little bit better. Maybe when I get a new USB hub, maybe I'll upgrade to a better camera too. So, I lied a little bit last week. I said we were going into. Last week I said that the lesson covered part of chapter 22. It did not. It ended in the very, very early verses of chapter 21. This week we're doing 1 Samuel chapter 21 and 22. And I kept most of it this time. Listen for the word of the Lord. David went down to Nob and met with a priest named Ahimelech. Ahimelech was shaking with fear and asked, "Why have you come alone? What's going on?" David said, "The king has sent me on a secret mission, and I'm going to rendezvous with my men in a secret location. In the meantime, do you have any food on hand?" The priest answered, "All I have at the moment is the consecrated bread. You can have it, but the men can only eat it if they're ritually clean. Have they been with women lately?" David said, "No, not for 3 days. I always make sure the men are clean, even on ordinary missions. It's especially important for this one." So the priest gave him the consecrated bread. Doeg the Edomite was there. Doeg was Saul's head shepherd, and he overheard everything. David then asked the priest, "Do you have any weaponry here? I was in such a hurry to get started, I left mine behind." The priest said, "We only have one. Believe it or not, it's the sword that belonged to Goliath when you killed him. We've kept it here all this time. You can have it if you want it." David replied, "There is no other sword like it in the world. Yes, I want it." So David left Nob and went to see Achish, the king of Gath. But when he got there, he overheard the men talking about him. He didn't feel safe, So he pretended to be insane, writing on the walls and drooling. Achish asked his servants, "Why did you let this lunatic in? Don't we have enough crazy people here already?" I love that line. Finally, David found a good place to hide in the cave of Adullam. When word got out that he was there, all the desperate men in the area rallied around him, fugitives, debtors, malcontents, and so forth. There were 400 of them, and he became their leader. Saul was sitting under a tree in Gibeah when he heard that David had been seen in the area. He had a spear in his hand, and he went on an angry rant. Listen up, people. You think David will take care of you like I have? Then why haven't you told me where he is? My own son is conspiring with him, and nobody said anything. Doesn't anyone feel sorry for me? Doeg the Edomite was there, and he spoke up. I've seen him. He was at Nob talking to Ahimelech the priest. The priest spoke with the Lord about it. Then he gave David some food and Goliath's sword. King Saul had Elimelech and all of the other priests at Nob brought to him. Saul said, "Why have you conspired against me with David? I hear you gave him food and a sword so that he can come after me." Ahimelech was shocked and said, "Of course I helped him. He's your son-in-law and the captain of the king's guard. He's the most loyal servant you've got. I don't know anything about any conspiracies." Saul said, "You and your entire bloodline will die." Then he turned to his guards and said, "Kill these priests." But the guards refused to lift a hand against the priests of the Lord. So Saul turned to Doeg and said, "You do it." Doeg killed 85 priests that day. Then he went through the town of Nob, killing every man, woman, and child. He even killed the babies and the livestock. Only one person escaped, named Abiathar. Abiathar ran to David and told him what happened. David said, "This is all my fault. I should have known Doeg would do that. You better stay here with me because we have a common enemy. I won't let anything happen to you." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Amen. Hello, Barbara. Good to have you here this evening. So like I said, I misspoke last week. I said we were in chapter 22. We were not. We were just in the very beginning of chapter 21. So we just covered chapter 21 and chapter 22. And David straight up lied to the priest because David showed up on his own, which was odd apparently. And the priests were like, "What's going on? Is everything all right?" And David lied. He said, "Oh, I'm on a secret mission. I've got men with me. They're just not here. I'm going to meet up with them at a secret place that I can't tell you about." So he lied to him. And why did he lie to him? Probably partly for David's own safety. Maybe he thought also for the sake of the priest's safety. Maybe he thought if they don't know what they're getting involved in, maybe they'll be safe. If that's the case, he miscalculated. Didn't realize how crazy Saul had gotten. This incident is referenced in Mark chapter 2 when Jesus is defending his disciples. The disciples have been walking with him along on a Sabbath day, and they were hungry, and as they walked along the road, as was common in those days, farmers were not allowed to harvest close to the road because that grain was supposed to be left there so that any travelers who were hungry would be able to pick some grain off and eat it as they went. So they were walking along, and the disciples did this, but it was the Sabbath. So they were challenged on that. And Jesus said, "Well, when David ate the consecrated bread, was that wrong? Or was that okay?" Then he's made the infamous statement that the Sabbath was created for man, not man for the Sabbath. So this is an important story, I believe, and I decided to include it because this is the beginning of David's private army. So for the next few years, David's going to be out in the wilderness with this army of 400 or so. And they didn't have in those days what we would today call a private military company. That's a 20th century invention. But they had mercenaries. They had swords for hire. And that's basically what David's private army is going to be. They're not going to work for Israel. They're going to work for whoever will pay them. And some of those people will be Israel's enemies, David's former enemies, in fact. Now, I want to be clear, though, that this army never fought against Israel. Throughout this whole time period, they were fugitives from Israel, but they always avoided engaging directly with Israel. In fact, if we do those stories, there will be opportunities when David could end this conflict by he's got opportunities to kill Saul, and he won't do it because Saul, in his mind, for now, is the rightful king of Israel. As long as Saul lives, he's the rightful king, and he's not going to kill the rightful king. If somebody else kills him, then that's a different story. But David's not going to do it, and his men are not going to do it. So they never did. So eventually, down the road, I don't remember if I mentioned this, but so Saul really is the king of the northern tribes, the 10 northern tribes, and David is going to be king of the southern tribes initially when he comes to power, and then eventually David's going to unite all 12 tribes into a single unified kingdom, the United Kingdom, as we sometimes call it. When he does that, he's going to keep this private army that he's got, and he is not going to fold it into Saul's army. They're going to be separate. So the army that had been Saul's is going to be basically the national army of the new Israel, and David is going to retain his own private army, which he's going to basically use as his special forces. And within that 400 that are his special forces, there's another smaller group. Depending on how you read the text, it's either 30 people or 37 people that are called his mighty men, and they're basically like his Delta Squad. They're his absolute elite troops, the best of the best. And he's going to continue to use them throughout the rest of his life. What does this story tell us about God? Well, God is not active in this story. It doesn't say God did anything. God does not speak in this story. Now, we said that last week too, but last week we said that the people who were acting in the story, David and Jonathan, were acting explicitly under the assumption that God was paying attention. They said that. I make this vow before you and before God. So they were invoking the Lord's name as a witness to what's going on. God's not spoken of in that way here. There's a dispute as to whether or not the priest at Nob consulted the Lord on David's behalf. Doeg says that he did. I removed this part because looking at the different translations, I couldn't really sort out what was going on here, and commentators aren't really exactly sure either. It looks like Doeg is saying that God, that the priests spoke to God on behalf, inquired of God on behalf of David, but Ahimelech seems to be saying, no, we didn't do that, or at least it's ambiguous what his answer to that question is, or if he did, his answer was more of a, well, yeah, we did, but we would do that for anybody. What's the problem? Ahimelech clearly does not seem to know, and some commentators disagree on this too. My read is that the priests at Nob have no idea that David is on the run and that major things are taking place within the royal court right now, and that their actions are entirely innocent. But yeah, Saul doesn't care. So God doesn't do anything in this. God does not say anything in this. God is spoken of, but not in any ways that are conclusive. So what does this tell us then about ourselves if we're not sure what tells us about God? Well, people are secretive, especially when they're scared. So David is on the run and he's scared, and that's why he doesn't tell the priests at Nob what is going on. Even when secrecy is understandable and perhaps even justifiable, like it is in this case, it often creates unexpected problems. Information vacuums always feed paranoia. So what then does this tell us about our relationships with God and each other? Now, this conversation might be a little bit tangential, but I think it bears. So in the church, we practice confidentiality, right? In fact, the Book of Discipline, originally when I came into ministry, when I started in ministry as a candidate, the Book of Discipline said that pastors would hold all confessions inviolate. That confidentiality will be held inviolate, that there were no circumstances under which pastors were to repeat anything that had been confessed to them confidentially. That eventually changed. Now we're mandated reporters, and if we have any reason to believe that somebody is in danger or that a crime has been committed that involves a child, then we are obligated to report that. That was not the case when I first came in, so I remember we had a discussion about that in one of my groups, and everybody in my generation, well, basically all of us in the student class, were saying that if somebody had confessed to us that they had done something terrible to a child, or that they were thinking about doing something terrible to a child, we would report that to the police, as Maryland law was clarifying on this when it came to clergy at the time. And we said, oh yeah, we would report that. And I remember one of the people at Wesley was absolutely shocked that we would do that, because there's the law of the land and there's God's law, which is a higher law, and he expected us to follow God's law, not the law of the land. And I said, well, God's law is not the discipline. God's law says that we got to protect children. But that was not universe. That was very much open to debate when I came in. But at any rate, okay, there's a couple of caveats under which we would break confidentiality, but generally speaking, we have confidentiality. Whenever anything is said to a pastor in private, at least as it relates to pastoral care, there is an expectation of confidentiality. Now, there are some exceptions to that other than the ones that I just mentioned. So, for example, if the pastor is supervising staff, there's always sort of a gray area. Is the pastor pastor to the staff, or is the pastor just boss to the staff? Because there are scenarios in which you're acting as a boss, and staff people might say something to you that needs to be taken up with the SPRC. And generally speaking, we would not consider that to be confidential. That would be an HR matter that would need to be resolved. But there might be instances in which a staff person says something to the pastor that the pastor would say, no, I wasn't being their pastor here. I wasn't being their boss here. I was being their pastor. And that would be confidential, and I would not repeat that. But whether or not the pastor and the employee are on the same page, well, it's the pastor's responsibility to make sure that they are on the same page. And I certainly have had DSs that would say to us, hey, I just want you guys to know, if you ever start talking about something that I would need to report to the bishop, I'm going to put my hands up and say, stop. Anything you say beyond this point can be repeated to the bishop. I will warn you when this happens, and that's our responsibility to do. I don't know that all pastors do that, though. I certainly have known pastors that got themselves into sticky situations that way. So that's a potential caveat. There is no expectation of confidentiality if somebody says something to you in a place that could be perceived as public, or could be perceived as being within earshot of other people. So in other words, if somebody says to me confidentially in my office, I've got cancer, but I don't want anybody to know about it, that's very clear. If somebody says to me in the sanctuary after church while people are still milling around, by the way, I've got cancer, and they don't give me any instructions, if I'm not on my toes and if I don't ask, all right, well, this is a public place. There's people milling around. Maybe it's not a secret. Or you could also think, well, wait a minute. They didn't lift it up during Joys and Concerns. It seems like they would have if they wanted to be public knowledge. So, in other words, there might not be a legal or professional expectation of confidentiality there, but a pastor with common sense would want to clarify that pretty quickly. But here's the one that to me is important, and that bears on this situation that David has gotten himself into with Ahimelech here. let's say a pastor and a member of a church have a conversation about something they disagree on. Maybe it's something controversial. Who knows? But it's a conversation that doesn't go the way the parishioner wants it to go. So the pastor, there's an expectation. If that's a private conversation, there's an expectation of confidentiality there. So the pastor cannot go around saying, so and so disagrees with what we're doing, and this is what they're going to do about it, unless they've made clear that this is public information. They cannot repeat that. Okay, or let's say the pastor and the person are having a disagreement about something, so the pastor has to keep confidential what was said behind closed doors, unless the other person chooses not to keep it confidential. In other words, if I have a private conversation with somebody and the person I had the conversation with doesn't like the way it went, and then they go out into the sanctuary and say, Pastor Steve just told me X, Y, and Z, okay, they have voided their right to confidentiality there. They no longer have a right to confidentiality, because if I feel that they have misrepresented what I said, I have the right to clarify what I said, and they cannot then come back and say, "Oh no, you can't repeat what was said in that room." Well, yeah, I can, because you just did, okay, or at least you claim to. So I know pastors who won't do that. They will not respond to things like that because they'll say that it's confidentiality, but I suspect that it's more fear. They might feel that it's to protect themselves. They might feel that it's to protect the person that they're talking about, or it might just be that this isn't something they want to deal with. If they're going to talk about it publicly, that means they got to deal with it publicly, and maybe they don't want to go down that road. But if they don't, then you've got this information vacuum that one person is trying to fill. Maybe other people are going to start trying to fill. And once again, information vacuums feed paranoia. Now, in the scripture lesson, Saul's already paranoid, right? We know this. We already know that he's crazy. So David doing things in secret is not going to make that situation better. I'm not saying he necessarily shouldn't do it, but he did put these priests in a situation. Now, if David had been honest with Ahimelech, the priests might have said, whoa, get out of Nob. I don't know what's going on between you and Saul, but we want nothing to do with any of this. I'll give you a one-day head start that I'm going to tell Saul that you were here, just so they knew that whatever it is you're doing, this is between you guys. I'm not getting in the middle of this. So if David had been open, that might have happened, okay? But if that had happened, David might not have gotten bread, but the priests might still have been alive at the end of the story. Or, if he had told them what he was up to, and they had decided to help him anyway, then if they had died, it would have been because of their own choices. As it was, I'm going to say that David put them in a difficult situation, put them in an unwinnable situation here in which they had no agency to make their situation better or worse. And he seems to have acknowledged this at the end. He said, I should have realized that this was going to happen. Yeah, David, you should have realized that this was going to happen. Of course, this is 4,000 years of hindsight, so I have a little bit of an advantage over David in that. But congregations are paranoid, are they not? I think congregations are a little paranoid. I think people in general are a little paranoid. So I remember somebody saying to me once, and this was somebody that I respected, but after we talked about it, we came to an agreement on it. Something had happened that somebody hadn't liked on a mission trip, and somebody started talking about it, and so I pulled together the adults that were involved, and I said, "All right, guys, I need to know exactly what happened so I can get ahead of this and make a statement." And one of them said, "Well, I was kind of hoping that we could just sort of nip this in the bud before people started talking about it." I'm like, well, people are going to talk about it because that's what people do. They talk. So given that they're going to be talking about this, let's get the accurate version out there before the rumor mill takes over. All right. So that's what I have to say about that. So in other news tonight, I'm not going to talk about Israel and Palestine, although I will say thank you if you're with us tonight, because that means that you're not watching Adam Hamilton's live stream tonight. Adam does his live stream basically the same time I do mine. His has much higher viewership, as well it should. But tonight he's got special guests on. Somebody speaking about Israel and somebody speaking about Palestine and about the conflict over there. And Adam does a very good job of trying to give both sides of every topic a fair shake. That doesn't mean he's neutral. That doesn't mean he makes a decision. That doesn't mean he won't take sides. Certainly sometimes he does end up taking sides, but when he takes sides, he always tries to preserve the humanity of the other side in so doing. So I'm sure that's very interesting, and I might try to watch that sometime later this week. After it's over with, I'll replay it. Thought you guys might want to know about that. I'm not going to talk about it just because whenever I look at other Methodist people talking about this, it upsets me. I'm not happy with the way our church is talking about this topic right now. All right, but what will we talk about tonight? This book, Brain Science and the Biology of Belief. Cindy's going to watch the rerun. Okay, Why God Won't Go Away. This is a book that came out about 20 years ago now, and one of the two authors has since died. The other one, Andrew Newberg, is still quite active. He's got new writing and research partners now, and among the founders of the field of neurotheology. So these are neurologists, scientists, PhD types, who study the effect that religiosity has on the brain. And they've got the next book I'm going to read is his most recent book, which is Neurotheology. And he has another one coming out next year that I've already pre-ordered. If you're into this type of stuff, it's kind of heavy nonfiction. It's not written for a scientific audience at all. It's written for a popular audience, but it's definitely for the NPR crowd, if you know what I mean. So if that's you, I recommend this book. And so this book, he talks about what they learned studying intense religious experiences. And what they did was they studied various religious people, Buddhists who were very good at meditation, nuns and other Western religious figures who were very, very good at contemplative prayer, people who had experienced religious ecstasies or what they call unity experiences, and studied their brains while active imaging of their brains while they were having these experiences, so they could see what was going on in the brain when people are having extreme religious experiences. And so they noticed some things in common. First of all, the brain lights up in a way that it doesn't light up in any other time. There are different parts of the brain that are acting simultaneously during religious experiences that normally do not act at the same time. They sort of act in tandem normally. If one's lit up bright, the other one's dim, but they're both going full force at the same time in this. I'm not going to go into the biology of it. If you're interested in that, you can go ahead and read the book. But so this is experiences that Easterners would experience through meditation, and they would say that they feel that they are being absorbed into the universe or becoming one with the universe. Westerners experience it through contemplative prayer, and they would say that they are becoming one with God or one with Christ during it. Their neurology is doing pretty much the same thing. Those are the intense experiences that happen with people who have made a lifetime out of contemplative practices. Much less intense versions of it can happen in worship. Even people who have the most extreme versions generally only claim to have had a few of these experiences over the course of their lifetime. It's not as if every time a monk or a nun or any other tradition. It's not as though every time they sit down and do their prayer or meditation, they expect to have this happen. They do not expect to have it happen. They hope it will, but it's a pretty rare thing, but it does happen. And only humans are capable of this. Only humans have the brain structures that can do this. And apparently, about 30% of people have had at least one extreme religious experience, like I'm talking about here, a moment of sort of enlightenment or ecstasy. I've had two. They were a long time ago. Once when I was a child, and once when I was a young adult, very early in ministry. The interesting thing is, on average, the 30% of people who have had these experiences, their average mental health is much, and physical health as well. Their average physical and mental health is much higher than people who have not, and they believe that there's a causal relationship there, that these experiences are good for you. And, this was new 20 years ago, because up until the mid-90s, all of Western psychiatry felt that that religion was pathological. And in fact, extreme religious belief was considered a disorder by the APA up until 1994. It's not anymore. They've recognized since the positive benefits of religious practice. And by the way, we are talking about practice here, not belief. Belief doesn't ever seem to correlate with much of anything, but practice definitely correlates with a lot of different stuff. So, so the old school psychiatrist would have said people who have these intense experiences, they're just like schizophrenics. They're having hallucinations. They're having, whether they're visual or auditory hallucinations, and these are going to cause them all kinds of problems. Well, what they found was that intense religious experiences have very, very different effects on people than the other kinds of hallucinations. And when I say hallucinations, when I had mine, I didn't see anything other than light, okay? It's just that I saw light when there wasn't light. It was as if I felt like I was sunbathing, lying on the beach with my eyes closed. You know how the light is pouring in, but I was in one case lying in bed at night, and in the other case sitting on the couch in the evening with most of the lights in the house off. So, and no rational physical way to account for that. At any rate, people who have had these kinds of experiences have very different reactions than people who have pathological hallucinations. It's the difference between delusions of grandeur versus an intense sense of humility, and the notion that you are a much smaller piece of the puzzle in the universe than you originally thought you were. People that have had pathological experiences, it dramatically increases their anxiety, and they have and if they associate these experiences with God, they walk away with the very strong belief that God is an angry, vengeful God, and they're terrified afterwards. Whereas people that have had their religious experiences have the exact opposite effect, that God is extremely loving, and they feel much less anxiety about everything after they've had these experiences. So this book makes the case that all religious experiences, oh wow, we're down to 2 people, is that right? Makes the case that all religious experiences, all religious rituals are designed to provide an opportunity in which some sort of experience can happen, whether it's individual prayer rituals or worship rituals, that they are designed with the purpose in mind of creating a space in which these things can happen, to sort of soften the earth for the mind to have these experiences. And I have to say I'm re-examining my beliefs on this, because my beliefs for a long time, was very wary of sort of setting up a worship service for the sake of inducing a mental state. Because, oh, okay, Kim and Mike are still here. You might be the last one. It says one now. I'm thinking, and Cindy's here too. Okay, my counter is wrong. Glad to see that. Glad to see my counter is wrong. Anyway, I've always been very concerned about, in particular, in some traditions where the worship service seems to be designed to induce a euphoria that, and Barbara's still here too, thank you, designed to produce a euphoric state that can then be abused or manipulated by the pastor or by the institution. That is certainly a concern. And of course, any religious experience afterwards, after it's over, can in fact be hijacked and manipulated, because you always have to sort of interpret what's just happened. And Judy's still here too. Charles is still here. Thank you. Glad to hear all of that. So the well can be poisoned, so to speak. And in fact, there was work done at one time showing that we have film footage of the audiences at Billy Graham crusades and film footage of the audiences at Hitler Youth rallies from the 1930s. And if you look at the facial expressions, you see the same kind of rapture in the faces of people. And I've known people who came back from political rallies speaking as if they'd had a religious experience. And they're talking about sort of a unity enlightened experience where they felt, kind of accepted and part of something and affirmed, and really kind of had an airy feel. But at a political rally that I would not have expected to produce something like that. So there is caution to be held here, but at the same time, I have always understood that one of the purposes of a worship service is to give people the opportunity to have an intimate experience with each other and with God. Okay? And if there is a mental state that is conducive to that, I think that perhaps we as religious leaders should be looking into that, and we should be looking into not how to exploit it, but perhaps this is more like cultivation. Perhaps this is more like, I'm not sure the word I'm looking for, but if you want to look at this like it's brain surgery, brain surgery can do a lot of damage. You don't want to ban brain surgery because it can do a lot of damage. You just want to be sure that the people who are doing the brain surgery are qualified to do it and are there for the patient's best interests. So this is something that I'm studying right now, and if anybody else is interested in studying it, I would encourage you to do it. The interesting thing about this, the writers are very clear. They went into this field of research thinking that our brain structures create our understanding of God through these processes. But what they have come to the conclusion of after years of study is that is not the case at all. They believe that our brain structures give us the unique ability to experience a God that actually does exist, and that it's these unique brain structures that people have that make us different from the other animals, because we're capable of talking to God about what our purpose is here on this earth. To me, that is spectacular science. They say we might not be able to observe and measure God, but we can observe and measure what he does to our heads. Wonderful. All right. So next week, probably not going to meet next week. Okay, I am anticipating at this time next week I will be on the road down to Southern Maryland to spend the weekend, part of the weekend anyway, with my parents. My parents. I don't think they ever watched this study anymore. My parents are in their 80s now, and this year they're not going to be cooking Thanksgiving dinner at all. We're all, my brother and I and my kids, and maybe my niece. We're going to be cooking on Wednesday and Thursday, and so I'm thinking rather than go down Wednesday morning, I think I'm going to go down Tuesday night with most of my family. So I will not be. We'll be taking next week off. I will be back in time for services on Sunday morning, so don't worry about that. Let's see. Joys and concerns. If anybody has any joys and concerns, I'll take 1 minute to talk about joys and concerns while I'm giving you. Thank you, Barbara. To the rest of you who are traveling, safe travels as well. If any of you are not traveling and you don't know where you're going to be spending Thanksgiving, I had some friends once who had a tradition of having Thanksgiving dinner at Golden Corral. And you might think that that's a terrible thing to do. But in fact, they reported that there's kind of a kinship among people who do that. And the people who work at Golden Corral on Thanksgiving are generally people who want to be there on Thanksgiving. And they all sort of bond a little bit through the experience. That it's actually kind of a really cool thing to do. Yeah, yes, thank you to you guys for saying that. So I'll give you a minute to put any joys or concerns you may have in there. In the meantime, I'll tell you that I went through a rite of passage today, moving me into a new stage of life. I had my first precancerous spot removed from the top of my head. Had it frozen off this morning, and and Nick says, "So does this mean you're an adult now?" I'm thinking, no, I think it's a different stage that I've entered into for that. Some of you already know this, but I wasn't able to speak of it publicly before today. After 16 years, Becky has been laid off from her job at Wells Fargo. Today was her last day. She's taken it pretty well. She knew this was coming. Wells Fargo. Maybe I mentioned this last week. Did I mention this last week? I feel like I wasn't supposed to mention this last week. If I did mention it last week, I really wasn't supposed to. But Wells Fargo, of course, is automating everything that it can, and everything that it can't automate, it's outsourcing to overseas markets where the labor is much cheaper. So she's going to be looking for an accounting job, preferably one that she can do at least partly from home, and if not partly from home, something that's fairly nearby. If you have any contacts or suggestions. She can't actually start a new job until January 14th. She's going to be paid to be on hold from now until then, so she has to do nothing. She could do stuff, she just can't work for pay between now and then. But if you have any suggestions, and so Becky is a CPA. She'll be reactivating her license over the next couple of months. It's an inactive license right now. She's a CPA. She has never done tax work. She has not done auditing since the very early days of her career. So she doesn't do public accounting. She doesn't do tax accounting. She's not an auditor. She does corporate finance. That's what she does. And the more she can work with numbers and the less she has to work with writing procedures, the happier she will be. So if any of you know what I'm talking about and have any leads, by all means, let us know. I don't see any other joys or concerns coming up, so just keep Becky in your prayers. Keep the world in your prayers. Hang on. An ambulance with a European-sounding siren just went by. All right. So pray for everybody, and let us pray ourselves now. God, give me grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, the courage to change the things which should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other, living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking, as Jesus did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen. All right, folks, I will see you all either Sunday morning or online sometime in the near future. If I don't see you between now and then, happy Thanksgiving.